I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
I have a lot of talk, and I want to leave some time for you to talk back to me. The subject is Malcolm X and the radical black ministry. If that was all we came for, we would have more than enough to do. I want to emphasize the fact that many times, if you don't know basic history, you can't even read a newspaper. Now, have any of us asked what is all the fuss about? This book and this rage over a book? Have anybody asked, how does this relate to us? How does this relate to our relationship to Islam? They left out the man who wrote the book, demeaned the African aspect of Islam. Nobody objected to that. Nobody. The African didn't object to it. The Arab didn't object to it. The fact that he left out the African component in Islam, nobody objects to that. First of all, you got to know what the component is to know he left it out. In fact, he demeaned the two great characters in Islam, the two African characters in Islam, and referred to them in a derogatory sense. It's not what anybody is objecting to. Bilal, these are the black makers of the faith. Ibn Rabat, Bilal, the first Mazoon, the first to call the faithful to prayer. He didn't mention Zayd bin Harith at all, and Zayd bin Harith, while Bilal was the first of the committed Muslims, he was the first to call the faithful to the prayer. So he was the spiritual man of Islam, the first African spiritual man of Islam. Zayd bin Harith was the first military man of Islam. Anta was the first literary man of Islam. It was these two Ethiopians, when the Prophet was about to be driven out of Arabia, when the religion was about to be destroyed, that advised the Prophet to send his key followers to Ethiopia. And the Prophet said, go to Ethiopia, go to that righteous land where no one is wrong. How did we produce a nation that got the reputation that were never wrong? The Greeks called the Ethiopians the blameless Ethiopians, the favorites of the gods. And when you bothered a Greek in those times, and the Greek wanted to get you off their backs, and look, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to tell my friends, the Ethiopians. Now they'll deal with you. How did Ethiopia get a reputation for having kept its promise in such a way that they were called blameless? And why did the Prophet Muhammad say, go to Ethiopia, go to that land of righteousness where no one is wrong? And they saved the faith. There in Ethiopia, they found shelter. They found a haven. And after the death of the Prophet, they went back and they got the religion underway. Bilal, who differed with the Arabs because they were fighting among themselves then, fighting among themselves now. He said the prayers only twice. Then he returned to Ethiopia. He saw the faith about to be fragmented among several branches of the Arabs, as it's still fragmented, and they're still arguing over these fragments. He saw the Arab beginning to become something he still is, the most corrupt element within Islam. And a lot of blacks who think they're practicing Islam is practicing Arabism. And there must be a clear distinction between. Now you must get this statistic. Now if someone really knew how to read the story, they would understand the African input. Because we are not left out of things. Because the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Russia meet and don't mention any of us, that don't mean we're out of it. It means that they assume that we are theirs for the taking and without permission. And they know that we're the world's richest people. A rich country but full of poor people. A contradiction in time. World's greatest resource of minerals. Okay, let's go back to this Islamic story. Because no one would have gotten, why is no one offended because Africa was left out and Africa was demeaned in the book? They're offended for something else. And why should anybody be killed for writing a book, be it ever so derogatory? Because nobody can force you to read a book. All right, now, during this period in Ethiopia, the faith had its foundations because Ethiopia nursed it in its cradle. Therefore, except for Africans and Ethiopia, the faith would never have been born. There are 127 million Arabs in the world. 70% of them live in Africa. There are more Africans who are Muslims than there are Arabs in the world. Why do you need an Arab's permission to practice a religion you helped to create? The main point is that we are always following behind someone else's cue, someone else's action, someone else's image. When the Europeans took over the world in the 15th and the 16th century, they not only began to colonize the world, they began to colonize information about the world. Then their greatest stroke of evil genius, they colonized the image of God. We're the only people that worship a God that we didn't choose for ourselves, somebody else chose for us. We belong to sororities. We think they're Greek. We don't know enough history to know that the Greeks had no fraternity and sorority until they came in touch with African secret societies. I didn't say don't belong to sororities and fraternities. I say, why do you use a carbon copy when you can go back to your original? Why not an African fraternity based on African original values? Now it seems as I'm going away from the subject, but I have my Baptist upbringing to remember. We frustrated ministers who didn't make it to the pulpit, we take our text, we leave our text, then we come back to the text to let you know that we know our text. I will now come to the text. Malcolm X and the radical African ministry. People do not understand that we are not only the world's most consistently radical people, we are the world's most consistent revolutionary people. Because black studies sometimes misses its mark. And nobody documents and explains to you the number of revolutions in the Western world that happened before the American Revolution. This is the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, and I'm one of the people in the committee to celebrate the French Revolution. Why? Because I wanted to make sure the African part got in there. The assumption is that the French Revolution was about something in France. It was about the levels of the French bourgeois arguing over spoils of the slave trade. And they let the working class see them chopping off each other's head, and the working class got the illusion that it was about them. They let the working class storm the Bastille and take some people out of prison they wanted out in the first place. So he had the illusion that he was part of a great revolutionary movement. His condition did not change one iota because of the revolution. Once we look at revolutions, Then we look at some of our revolutions that we have forgotten. They came before the American Revolution. The Babiche revolt in Guyana, the revolt in Palmares, the revolt in Bahia, the revolt in Cuba as early as 1527. So the more I explain, the more I let you know there's nothing extraordinary about the extraordinariness of Malcolm X. We have seen his kind before. They are interwoven through our told history. Now let's go back and see if we can see some of the early ones whose revolt changed the status of their day and ultimately changed the status of the world. All history is a current event. Everything that ever happened continues to happen. The first kid that threw a pebble in the ocean is still influencing the ocean and will for all times to come. The first man that sneezed is still influencing the atmosphere, and be it ever so minuscule, he will influence it for all times to come. Things are in the world, but things never leave the world or stop influencing the world. So what I'm talking about now, things were unknown to Malcolm X, and yet these things were the antecedents of Malcolm X. First, let's look at human societies before Europe. I know this is difficult for you because you don't think there was anything in the world before Europe. Let's look at human societies before Europe. There was no Europe. When the people of the Lower and the Upper Nile came together and decided on rules by families and called them dynasties. They had thousands of years before then. And then Africans began to set in motion the spirituality that would go into the making of modern religions. I make a clear distinction between spirituality and religions. I maintain most of the world's Western religions tone down spirituality. Western religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, did spirituality a disservice because they began to create a kind of God that, like the humanity of the original African God, was a God of love. They began to create gods of fire, gods of revenge, gods that they could turn to justify the enslavement of other people. They began to produce gods that had no godliness. And every one of them, in some way or the other, justified the enslavement of other people. But before this catastrophe took place, when out of the thinking of the Nile Valley came religion, came the spirituality that was universal, the Africans had a spiritual revolution. And this spiritual revolution brought them to the conclusion that God was in everything, and God was everywhere. God was a part of all living things. And if you wanted to pray, you could pray to the wind, because God was in the wind. You could pray to a local cockroach, because God was in the cockroach. But most important, you could pray to yourself, because God was in you. Now, when we reached a point where man began to say, my God is better than your God, the spirituality that the African created is now being converted into a denominational thing, putting one against the other. Now we began to create gods of vengeance. And people would come into Africa and copy African folklore and personify themselves into this folklore and palm it off on the world as truth. When many times it's an illustration of the truth. The illustration of the truth need not be true. If you get truth across, if the lesson of truth gets across, the lesson you use to illustrate it don't necessarily have to be true. And a lot of people are confused on this. This is why very few people know how to read the Bible. And very few people know that the Bible is going through 28 different versions. That means different interpretations. So if it was originally true, after all this to tampering, there's some questions about certain portions of it now, at this portion. All right. I'm talking about a spiritual revolution that took place before there was a Europe. When African people were functioning for thousands of years without any assistance from foreigners. It's difficult for you now, having lost your confidence, having lost your connection with the concept of state management and state structure, having been programmed into dependency. It's difficult for you to understand and picture there was a period in the world when nobody helped you do nothing. There was no foreigners, no place, and you ran nations and ran them for thousands of years, not just a few years. When you had a humanity coming out of your spirituality, you had no word for jail because no one had ever gone to one. You had no word for orphanage because no one had ever thrown away any children. You had no word for senior citizens home because no one ever threw away grandma and grandpa. Social Security was built into the structure of the society itself. Now, while I've read every known book of significance on Africa, I've done a whole lot of research by just going to Africa and living among African people and having them explain the weddings, the wakes, the ceremonies to me. Then I've gone to Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana and seen the duplication of the same thing that we did not lose. And yet you go and tell Black America you're doing something African, he want to hit you. And yet, those African traits is coming down through the years. Now, when I want to sound important and explain something that I haven't quite explained to myself, I said, well, this is genetical transference. Down through the genes. I know I have to explain it because I don't know how. But somehow we remembered. Now, what I'm trying to point to are intellectual and spiritual revolutions before we were brought against our will to the United States. And I'm dealing with the spiritual personality in our history that were the forerunners of a Malcolm X type. During the third dynasty that emerged in Egypt around 2800 BC, a commoner named Imhotep. He was the world's first multi-genius. He was so competent. He was good at a whole lot of things on equal levels. He built the step pyramid, which gave people the idea that you could build a house that has more than one story. He was the world's first physician. And he lived 2,000 years before the Greek who's called the world's first physician. And if you read the autobiography of the Greek who's called the world's first physician, he said, I am a child of Imhotep. I got my inspiration from Imhotep. He was an abdominal surgeon. And I gave a lecture on Imhotep as the world's first abdominal surgeon. And one of the little middle-class kids, when I was in the anti-poverty program, I don't even know what he's doing there. He wasn't poor and, and dressed too well, offended some of the other kids. But he sat out front. I can tell he was smirking or smiling. A few years later, I'm changing planes in Denver. And I see this kid. If you know goods on a man, sometimes you can see a man half a block where you know that that's no cheap suit. the brother had his clothes on. And they was hanging right and bought right. And I'm here, I'm glad to see him, of course. It's been almost 10 years. I said, what you doing out here? He said, I'm a surgeon. I said, this is my headquarters. I said, what do you do? He said, I am chief of abdominal surgery, Denver General Hospital. Visiting professor at one of the schools. He said that I heard your lecture on Imhotep as the world's first doctor and multi-genius. I did some more research and lectured on Imhotep to my class. And do you mind, sir, if I didn't mention that I got the information from you? I said, sir, you pay me a compliment. Anytime a student goes beyond the teacher, he's doing what the teacher trained him to do. The teacher should train the student to replace him. I said, have you ever occurred to you that you could have stolen from a second grader? At least you know where to get your sources. Now, among the figures in our history who were radical, who changed the time of that day and challenged the status quo of that day, Imhotep is singularly outstanding. He is singularly outstanding because he began the pyramid building age. And this pyramid building age lasted up until the 6th century. It didn't discontinue during the 6th century, but it was combined with the temple age, building vast temples and building along with pyramids. This building stopped in the 13th century. And some people say they built the pyramids, didn't even arrive until the building stopped in the 12th century. But some people say they built the pyramids, they came to Africa and built the pyramids, didn't get there until the 13th century. All the pyramids had been built. The Sphinx had been built. Africans had already revolutionized religion, revolutionized the concept of human relationship. The idea of balance had already occurred. If you have a god, you got to have a goddess. The woman is the counterbalance of man. And the one is not total without the other. The idea of the lineage coming down through the female side had already started. The king's son can never be king, but the king's sister's son can be king. The female gods had already appeared. Had ruled, known as Hathor by the west. The goddess Nut. And look at the African complement to females. The goddess Nut job was to take in the sun at night, put it in her stomach, and let it out in the morning. So they had assigned symbolic to women the idea of lighting up the world. See, man wasn't so insecure that he couldn't let woman go as far as her mind would take her without exploiting her. We will not deal with the fact that Western man and the Arabs are not only womanizers, but they fear women, and they fear them in power. See, the woman in Africa had already established the pattern of riding at the head of her army, not behind it. At this period, they would go on, although Ethiopia would produce more female queens of substance than Egypt, but the ones in Egypt are better known because Egypt is at the front door of Africa, and it gets more publicity. Now, in looking at the radical ministry before Malcolm X, my point is that radical ministry did not consist of man only. That women gods played as important part in this radical ministry as men. And man recognized that. Now, when we look at many of these female gods, especially Hathor, because the practice of Hathor is she's generally pictured with a female torso and a cow's, a female face and a cow's torso, cow's body. This is where the whole concept of worship of the sacred cow spread to India, where part of the matrilineal system spread to India. I should read Shekanta Diop's book, The Culture Unity of Black Africa. It's all there because I'm not going to talk about anything that can't be found in some book, someplace. Because a professional teacher cannot afford to say anything that can't be proven somewhere. You can't play games, Because when you go to Congo, they don't lower the light bill because you're a distinguished professor. They charge you the same bill. So those practicalities have to be taken into consideration. And if you make your living teaching, you can't look ridiculous because nobody will hire you after that. Okay, now, when we look at this revolution, when we look at the fact that a negative revolution occurred with foreigners coming into Africa, suppressing its culture, taking away its revolutionary fiber, and then when they recovered this and went on with the 17th and the 18th dynasty, we find not only new revolution, but we find new concepts of spirituality. When we look at that 18th dynasty, now it's the 18th and the 19th dynasty Dr. Ben and I argue about. One of the main reasons we argue about it is that we enjoy the argument. I will never yield to him that the 19th dynasty was the greatest dynasty ever to sit on any throne at any time in the history of the world, because I know the 18th dynasty is the greatest dynasty ever to sit on any throne at any time in the history of the world. Now, we generally sell this argument by arguing about who paid the dinner for the other one the last time. And he insisted that I paid it the last time. Now it's his turn to buy the dinner. And sometimes this ends in a compromise, and sometimes this ends with him slipping away the money and say, come on, let's go. The bill is over. It's all over. He wins it that way, because we generally go to restaurants where he has got connections. All right, now. Okay, all right, now. I'm saying that this is a man that I've worked with for over 20 years, known over 30 years, and love him as a brother, and have those creative disagreements with him that enhances both of us and sharpens both of our concept of the approach to history. I learned a great deal in my relationship with Dr. Ben, because he's a specialist on one side of Africa, I'm a specialist on the other side, then I'm kind of a general practitioner with a good knowledge of all of it. Now, we're talking about the radical black ministry before Malcolm X. And the one radical ministry that did the most, that influenced us to this day, was Imhotep, whose original name was Amenhotep IV. A sickly boy, didn't want to come to power, son of the great Queen Tai, about 1360 BC, finally came to power and permitted the colonies of Egypt to succeed from Egypt. So if you don't want to be under Egyptian rule, you don't have to fight. We let you go. And he let the colonies, gave them their freedom. Then they pledged allegiance to Egypt, and Egypt was stronger than ever without a colony. Many historians interpreting the life of Akhenaten not only disagree with them, but thought that he did Egypt a disservice by letting the colonies go. Walter Weigel, in his book, great personalities of the ancient world. He calls his chapter on Akhenaten, The Adventures of a Nigger King. He had, whatsoever it means, the stereotype features that's assigned to African people. I don't agree with the stereotype features because I know that there are more physical types in Africa than almost any place in the world. And there are Africans who have identical features as the Europeans and who are jet black. There are Africans who are jet black with curly hair. There are Africans who are jet black with coarse hair. There are Africans who are moderately brown, not mixed with Arabs or Europeans. This is why the overuse of the word black sometimes need to be questioned, because black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are, but it don't always tell you how you look. Because the name of a people, when properly called, must always reflect land, history, and culture. Black reflects on land, history, and culture. Color don't reflect nothing. Negro is an insult. So if you've got no African attached to your name, someone has called you out of your name. Because we are an African people, wherever we are on the face of this earth, we are an African people. And on that we got to be clear. But now back to Akhenaten. It is assumed that the Jews gave the world monotheism. It is also assumed that Akhenaten gave the world monotheism. It's wrong both ways. Neither one gave the world monotheism. Akhenaten never pretended that he gave the world monotheism. All he did was to correct the corrupt Egyptian priesthood of that day, who was telling people you can't travel to distant lands because God cannot be there to protect you. So he was telling them God is everywhere. God is in everything that lives. And everywhere you go, God can protect you. Moses, an African, who took up with the Jews belatedly, an African born in Africa. I won't get into the concept that maybe the girl who put him in the stream, found him in the stream, put him in the stream, and maybe it was her child in the first place. Be that as it may, because that story has appeared in many languages, in many other cultures. You know the one side of it. You know the Western biblical side of it. But there are other stories, there are other Noah stories, there are other flood stories. There's a book by Sir James Frazier, The Folklore of the Old Testament. Almost one volume is devoted to flood stories as they appeared in other civilizations. John Jackson has written a book called Pagan Origins of the Christ Myth, showing you that the Christ figures appeared in a whole lot of civilizations, and many of them 1,000 miles apart. Okay, now, Akhenaten revolutionized the spirituality of that day by restoring to people what they had in the first place. When Moses took up with the Jewish people, because he had some difficulty with the house where he had grown up as a pampered prince, he said, "Obey my God, I'll be your leader." Now, he would ask them to obey the God and the religious concepts of Akhenaten. And this man, a revolutionary spiritual figure, would now set in motion a concept that we still hold on to. What we have to look back and look at these ministers, the first ministers of the world, these priests, because many times they were priest gods, priest deities, higher than a pope. And these priest deities were also something else. They were also scientists. See, all the nonsense about separation of church and state is a bogus lie, because there's no separation of church and state. This country was designed everybody else kidding themselves. And everybody else is kidding themselves. And the Catholics are kidding themselves, the Jews are kidding themselves. The white woman got the vote day before yesterday, 1921. And when she got the vote, after all the fight of the suffrage and all the colorfulness of her campaign, she didn't get the vote until she got it across to white men in a country where no white woman can vote, some black men can vote. Then they gave her the vote on his back. And they're giving her affirmative action the same way. Now, a Catholic was briefly the president of the United States, and they didn't even let him finish. I think he could have been a decent president. He could have been a meaningful president had he given him time to get started. When we look at the Protestant design of the United States, we look at there's something that has never really been a true separation of church and state. They separate when they want it separated. So that means that Protestantism has been a main force that controlled the politics of the United States. You almost had a Catholic president. And you didn't almost have a Greek. Don't you kid yourself. You didn't almost have it. He didn't stand a running chance. They not only objected to him, they objected to his wife. And they lied to their teeth about it to let him get out there and knock himself out thinking he's going to become president of the United States. It had already been decided. All right, now let's go back to Africa where we feel a little more secure. The idea of the radical ministry continued. It continued through the last period of the glory of Egypt, when the Africans from the south went up to conquer and to show their cousins how to rule a nation one more time. The 25th dynasty came from the Sudan. Castor, Piyanki, Taharqa, starting in 751. And what did they do when they went to Egypt? They wanted to know, are you obeying the moral law as laid down by the goddess Maya? Now, can you look at this today? 3 men went up to conquer Egypt. And the main thing they wanted to know, are you obeying the moral law laid down by the last of the great African female gods? You think we'd go to war right now over the concept of female? Anybody want to war with Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science? No, ain't nobody gonna fight no war over it and get angry about it. Well, we're talking about revolutionary moral law. And this last move into Egypt from the south was to make sure that they obeyed the revolutionary moral law as laid down by the last of the great female gods. This will continue, this whole revolutionary approach to religion in the mostly spirituality, this revolutionary approach to human relationships. It would have a setback under the Romans. The Romans then were so disgraced themselves in the management of Christianity because it didn't fit their character then, don't fit their character now. The 2 things you can set your clock by and make sure to always be on time is that the European will never live and apply Christianity and democracy to himself and the whole world. He won't do it. Because his way of maintaining power is a violation of everything that religion stands for. One of the reasons why the African was then and still are rather naive in his relationship to religions, that he assumes that people mean what they say. We still out Muhammad and out Pope to Pope. We are the true believers. Because we are the true believers, we find it difficult to deal with people who don't mean what they say. Now, when the Romans had so disgraced themselves in the management and the mismanagement of this religion, a camel boy began to grumble and to talk with other camel boys. He asked for reform. And had he gotten reform, he would not have called for a new religion. But he discovered that the Europeans then controlling most of North Africa was incapable of reform. And he called for a new religion. That new religion was Islam. And it was this religion, with the military force of Africans, that pushed Europe out of the Mediterranean back into Europe, and Europe had to feed on itself. A diet that was not so attractive, because Europeans rise to great glory only when they have large areas outside of Africa to exploit. This explains why they came out of the Middle Ages, people poor, land poor, and resource poor, and recovered at other people's expense, and still maintained themselves at other people's expense. America consumes the bulk of the tea in the world and don't produce 1 pound of tea. America uses most of the gem diamonds in the world and don't produce one of them. And the industrial diamonds don't produce one of them. Now suppose Africa, with all of its manganese, all of its cobalt, all of its zinc, suppose Africa would say, you don't get nothing until you treat my brothers right. Suppose Pan-Africanism came alive as a political African world union. They could change the world. Because the essence of power is the ability to include and exclude. Now this concept of using the priest as the spiritual leader of the nation, and sometimes the scientists too, because at Timbuktu, at the University of St. Corey, the great scholars, especially Ahmed Barber, the last of the great chancellors, always told his students, revere God and science. He did not separate God from science, because science, religion, and the state was one and the same. And one had to relate to the other and to complement the other. Now, after the passing of this great period, another period of radical spirituality appeared in the Congo. After they threw the Portuguese out, this is an event in African history forgotten by the world. They threw the Portuguese out in the 1590s. And they did not come into European domination again until 1884. From 1600 to 1620 was the golden age of Reconstruction, when they not only gave up the Portuguese religion, gave up Portuguese cooking utensils, started using Portuguese name, and went on to rebuild that country and to have a golden age right in the middle of the slave trade and in spite of the slave trade, under the leadership of a great African spiritual king Shamba, the long gone gold, who outlawed warfare. All right, now, in summation, my point is that the radicalism of a Malcolm X relates to our totality. That we've been producing these radical ministers, and Malcolm was a radical minister. That this is not new in our history. It went down to the end. And started war on the liquor traffic. A set of wars that's been forgotten. During the McCarthy period, when everybody was hounding me as being a dangerous something or another, I wasn't so proud like the other radicals. The other radicals, they just cried all over the place. I went and got myself a job. I mean, it didn't have to be fancy. He was night supervisor of cleaning at a broadcast company. Sounded like a decent job to me. It's never in my life that I had made $4.80 an hour. I was doing all right. Wasn't doing a whole lot of work either because the job was practically easy. Then I began to do research with this free time. I wrote several works. One, the lives of Africans who resisted European encroachment. A lot of it appeared in newspapers, and when I got to Africa, a lot of it appeared in newspapers there. No one ever wanted to publish it as a book because one white publisher told me that you have proven that Africans who never heard of a military school or wore a store-bought shoe outgeneraled some of the finest minds in Europe. He said, you have proven it. And I have enjoyed reading it, but I don't choose to pay you to do it. So the book wasn't published, and I still got it. And now I'm going to revise it and include the women. Some of the greatest of the resistance leaders in Africa were women. There's only one under the banner of Islam, Amina from Ghana, from what is now Nigeria. Because I'm research consultant for the Budweiser company, and it took me 7 years to convince them to use African queens as well as kings. When I finally convinced them, and I looked at the research on Amina, I decided I had to do a little editing. This was a brilliant woman warrior who conquered cities and protected most of what is now northern Nigeria. But her enemies told such lies about her, I wanted to make sure that these lies didn't get in the script. And one of these lies was that each time she conquered a city, she'd take on a new lover. And if he wasn't satisfactory, she executed him in the morning. There was no proof of this at all, just a rumor. So I decided to leave it up. Okay, all right. When we entered the 20th century, we had 100 years of the radical ministry. Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnet, who said, my motto is resistance. And as we entered the 20th century, Bishop Turner, all of these forerunners of Malcolm X. It was a preacher from Barbados that found the Masons. I mean, ministers played a more revolutionary part in our life then than now. When we came to the Garvey period, and Garvey began to find a revolutionary church focused on African image. Who said the angels didn't look like us? Who said the deities didn't look like us? He began to say black angels and black saints. This was the revolutionary approach under Marcus Garvey and Bishop McGuire, who headed his church. So when we arrived at the civil rights period, in the emergence of a Martin Luther King, the antecedents of King was over 3,000 years old, because we had produced that type before. Akhenaten believed in nonviolence, outlawed warfare. Shamba Balongo believed in nonviolence, outlawed warfare, and sent soldiers to knitting, of all things. And some of the knitting that they did can be found in the Brooklyn Museum right now. I mean, we are the only people who would take a chance with something as impractical as nonviolence. To survive, that means the other person must respect the fact that you are nonviolent and be nonviolent toward you. I will not get into what Martin Luther King did not learn about Mahatma Gandhi, because it's another lecture, and it's a long lecture. Most of us don't know Mahatma Gandhi, who was a brilliant Indian nationalist, a good B actor like most politicians must be, a liar when it was convenient like most politicians must be, but who loved India so much he didn't have no time to even speak a word for the Chinese being kicked around next door. He was solely an Indian nationalist. I'm saying that Martin Luther King is not unrelated to it. Now, the transformation of a Malcolm from being a pimp, hustler, dope seller, dope taker is a wonderful story in America. And it tells us something about American education that's not complimentary. His study methods were so unorthodox. Here's a man sits in prison, he want to learn words, and he picks up a dictionary and starts with A. Let's go right straight to the dictionary. It's a good way to improve your vocabulary. But who learns it that way? I grew up with a phenomenal memory. And gamblers used to take me around. I bet you this boy could tell you how many ships in the Japanese Navy. And I could tell him. I always worked for white people who threw away the almanacs. So once they threw away the almanacs, I memorized it. So all of my information was a year old, but who knew that? This wouldn't intrigue me except the fact that I've tried some of the same methods. Remembering almanacs and yearbooks. And I could tell how many ships in the Japanese Navy. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to a kid 11, 12 years old in Georgia? But the stopper with the gamblers won a lot of money on, I bet you can tell you the second name of the first wife of Clark Gable. What's that to a kid living in the slums of Georgia? I started remembering everything. But the one thing it taught me, how to retain information. Then I had to dump all the irrelevant information out of my mind to learn how to retain information of some significance. It was a good form of personal training. Now, from Malcolm X's background and from the attempt to destroy his confidence, he pulled himself up by making a connection with a religion, Islam. He began to use that religion almost as a purification rite. Began to adjust his diet, began to adjust his attitude, began to adjust his habit. And finally he would emerge as a minister. And after the brief period in Detroit, he would come to New York to build the leading mosque. And he became the spokesman for Elijah Muhammad. And he not only became the spokesman for Elijah Muhammad, he put the movement on the map. He had great respect for Elijah Muhammad. And many times when Malcolm X was saying, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, Malcolm X was teaching original Malcolm X lessons that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad never thought about. But yet he had his respect for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was no matter what he said, but to preface it with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us. Malcolm X is being misunderstood now. Some people trying to make him into a leftist that he was not. Some people make him into a socialist that he was not. Some people trying to make him into an integrationalist. Malcolm X in Mecca observed that there were white Muslims, brown Muslims, black Muslims, all worshiping side by side, which is basically true. Although there's some discrimination in Mecca against African people that he did not see. It was an observation, and an observation is not an analysis. But he was one of the finest leaders to emerge from the black working class in this century. I have said under other circumstances, he might have been a king and he might have been a good one. He might have made a nation and he might have destroyed one. But he left his imprint on our times, mainly in his last message to the grassroots. He defined nationalism in the role of land in relationship to nation in a simple way it had never been done before. One thing about Martin Luther King, he could wash your emotions, he could make you feel good, but you say the next day you couldn't say what he said. But with Malcolm X, he would say it so plain.
So good.
Yeah, and so good. You would remember it. You would remember it forever. His parables were taken straight from African folklore. And he always chose the right one to illustrate the point. It has been said about Malcolm, because his imprint on our life was so explicit, that freedom was his land and dignity was his destiny. We will never know where he was going because he was cut down while he was still growing. We will never know what he could have been because he was cut down before he had an opportunity to be what he could have been. He internationalized the problem of civil rights into human rights, and was the first one to take this to African states who had agreed to take the problem to the United Nations where it belonged. This put him on a collision course with history and a collision course with power. We have to look and see who is walking in his footsteps. And I am not talking about religion now, because you can walk in his footsteps and be a Muslim, you can walk into it and be a Protestant, you can walk into it and be otherwise. Because he was moving a people toward nationness, toward human beingness, to consider what we have not properly considered, that between the West Indies and South America, there's over 200 million African people. There are millions of African people in the Pacific. There's over 100 million in India, not including the Dravidians, who number 10 million. The population of Africa has been counted as 500 million for over 50 years, which infers that the African man is sleeping away from home and not renewing himself. Take that with a grain of salt. If you had a proper statistic, it will prove to you that the population of Africa is more extensive. What is for us tomorrow as a people, given the life of Malcolm X, given the message to the grassroots, given the call to return to the land and claim the land, because land is the basis of nations. We are the only people in the world who can agree to control only that belongs to us and not threaten other people, because that belongs to us is so extensive. If we manage the continent of Africa, 12 million square miles, islands in the West Indies, parts of South America, what time do we have to conquer anybody's country? We have neither time or energy. But the idea is that we gave the world its first humanity. And the world cries out for someone who wants to rule the world without blowing up the world. And that the carbon copy of our master's originality has been worn out, if indeed he ever had any originality. Ready or not, like it or not, we are the world's next great people in power. And inasmuch as we've given the world humanity once, and give it a science once, we must be re-educated to the new responsibility of nation management and the nation concept, and create the kind of world where all people can walk among us in safety. We who gave the world the first humanity is capable of giving the world the next humanity. That's tomorrow's work. And the best time to start tomorrow's work is today. Thank you very much.
And Mr. Kenneth Christie, the Assistant Director of the NOAA program, will indicate individuals to raise questions. If you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand.
Are there any questions? The lady in yellow.
Power first over themselves. But my point of safety is that they can regain power without being a threat to the world. That was the main point. Now, half of human history, over half of human history, had already occurred before the first European wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window. We have not, and we sometimes tremble assuming that the world waited in darkness for them to bring the light, when as a matter of truth, when they entered other countries, they put out the light.
Any other questions? The man in the gray.
I respect you and I respect our ancestors. Could you talk about what Dr. Ben is doing in Egypt right now? What are some of the things that he has discovered in regards, or rediscovered, in regards to the first invaders into Africa?
Dr. Ben is teaching at El Azhar, the University of Cairo. And I was at first frightened for him. I'm not totally unfrightened to this day because I just don't believe the Arabs are going to let him teach the truth consistently and get away with it. But among the things Dr. Ben has discovered is something we've suspected all along. In the famous burning of the library at Alexander, where some of the greatest documents in the world supposed to have perished, some people took some of the best books out of the library before the library burned. And some of these documents seen will cause history to be revised. And that the first invaders of Africa, the first visitors were the Hebrews, and the Hebrews were the collaborators with the invaders. But the Hittites are so-called shepherd kings who came in 1875. Then has found some of the statues, and he's looked behind their heads, and he knew these was clearly dreadlocks. The European never wore any dreadlocks. Dreadlocks don't knit together on white hair. So what are we dealing with now? We assumed that Africa was being invaded for the first time by non-Africans. These were Africans from Western Asia who had formerly lived in Egypt, invading their former homeland. This will cause all history to be revised. The Hebrews served under them. And if they were slaves at all, and I maintain they were not at all, that the concept of Hebrew slavery in Egypt is a myth and a lie. But if they were slaves at all, they were slaves during the foreign occupation. They rose to great heights during this occupation and produced the world's first wheeler-dealer politician, Joseph, called the provider. We have to go back and look at history. Once we read the Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of this, the document of so-called laws, and read the books of the Bible that were not laws, we're going to have to rethink the concept of history, and we're going to have to divide history from folklore. A lot that we think is history is nothing but folklore. There's nothing wrong with folklore, so long as you identify it as such.
Man in blue. Yes.
Professor Clarke, I want to thank you because you really provide us with a wealth of information. I listen to you on WBAI. You're so very informative all the time. But one of the questions I want to ask you, recently a Canadian study was done by some professor, and he tried to categorize intelligence in people. And what he did is he said that first it's the Asians who are the intellectuals, and then it's the Europeans, and then it's the African Americans. I mean, could you comment on why do you have to do these kind of things in order to, I don't know, to subjugate people? Could you kind of like...
Well, why do they have to classify people third world? And why do we always get in the number that's numerically at the bottom? We didn't do the classifying. What they wanted to do now, what the Western world is looking for, is an Asian ally against us. Yes. And they're pampering the Asians, so when they go against us, they can get Asian support. And there's a lot of Asians who would go along with it, but I don't think enough of them will go along with it to make the greatest difference. What do you think the picture of the Africans was about? If to mean the Africans, if you knew African history, a lot of things Ali Mazrui said was not only incorrect, but was demeaning. He comes to Ghana and tells a political joke. He goes to Nigeria and tells a political joke. But all the great history behind these two countries. He whitewashes the role of Islam and the Arabs in Africa. You have to separate Islam from the Arabs. If you could ever separate Islam from the Arabs, you will understand to what extent they betrayed this religion by inserting slavery and using it to oppress people. At the end of the session, he said that there's only 2 million Africans in the Arabian Peninsula. He's trying to deny the Arab slave trade. He wouldn't have asked that question to me because I know why the other Africans went. They went into the Portuguese slave trade at the later period. They were processed at Zanzibar, one of the largest slave trading ports in the whole world. A lot of them went into India earlier. The Arab slave trade started 600 years before the European slave trade. People don't want us to know the real truth about ourselves, but the role of the picture, that picture was that series was paid for by the Edinburgh Trust, a Jewish youth newspaper trust in Philadelphia. It cost $750,000. They only got $600,000 from the National Endowment that removed its name. Why would a Jewish foundation pay for an Arab-oriented film series? They're buttering up the Arabs so that one day you will see the Jews and the Arabs in the same political bed against us. It seemed incredible. That's why that's why it can happen. You won't watch the signs and stop it. See, once you deal with Africa's back door, the whites in South Africa, you got to deal with that front door. If Africa's ever going to be free, it's got to be free of everybody who came there as an invader. And everybody in Africa who can be called an African, who cannot be called an African, is either an invader or a descendant of an invader. You have to ask the invader, what is your intention in my house? Either you pledge loyalty to my house, or you get out of my house. He was a Muslim. His direction, his religion, basic religion was Islam. He saw no contradiction in his founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He was uniting black people across all religious and political lines. He saw no contradiction in being a Muslim and working in a coalition that would consist of African people of all kinds of religions and African people who had no religion at all. This was Pan-Africanism. Huh?
Is it not true that his primary focus and hope was that African people in America would accept Islam eventually?
He did not say this. No, wait a minute. The Organization of Afro-American Unity was formulated in my living room. I located the documents. We were clear about a separation between the religion and the politics and the religion of most of the people. We were clear about the fact that they all needed to work together.
What I'm saying, though, is that Malcolm's motive for accepting that strategy at the time he was alive was because that the African people here were brainwashed in the white man's Christianity, but that he would want African people to accept Islam as the only true solution. In his words.
There is nothing in any documents, there's nothing in any conversation I have ever heard him say I had with him that indicated that.
How about the autobiography?
Huh?
As told to Alex.
He didn't. In the autobiography, he explained his relationship with a whole lot of people who were not Muslims.
What I'm saying here,
Malcolm had a shallow cabinet.
well,
Excuse me. We want to raise questions and not have a debate, okay? Let's go to the next question.
How about the woman right here in the blue?
Yes.
Good evening, Dr. Clarke.
Yes, dear.
It's a pleasure having you here. What I wanted to say, as a philosopher, do you feel that we as black people have to start all over as a plant and reroot ourselves, and then we will blossom and be the nation that will be?
I think we don't have to completely start all over, but I think we have created a whole lot that we can use as a base for moving forward.
Yes.
I think we're going to have to Africanize ourselves both politically and spiritually.
Yes.
And that don't mean starting all over. That means building on foundation. We're going to have to discard a whole lot. Because we brought a lot of garbage from other people. It has nothing to do with our salvation. We're going to have to get closer to our children. We're going to have to build the family unit all over again. And we have to remember that for most of our existence in America, the family was against the law. We have to build it strong. We have to rebuild the image of the man as the authority figure, working in partnership with the first authority figure, that is the mother.
Right.
The mother as authority figure does not negate the father as an authority figure. Because one does not function well without the other. We're seeking a blend. We're not trying to install new dictators in the home, laying down the law. A father is a teacher. He is a trainer for the family. My mother was always wiser than my father. And she never crushed his feelings. And she would approach him and she said, John, I suggest. And her suggestion, he mulled it over in his, And when he carried out her suggestion, she congratulated him for having such a good idea. She knew how to handle power, and she knew that she was the ruler of that family. She had no insecurity about it, and she knew he was subservient to her, but he was not submissive. There's a world of difference between what I'm saying. She respected him at all times and never encroached on his manhood, not even one time. That's a learning. I think she went to the 3rd grade, but I'm not even sure of that. And yet she was a learned woman. Learned in the ways of handling a family, having children, keeping them together. She was a washerwoman. She was saving 50 cents a week for my venture college education. She said, this boy's going to Tuskegee, even if I had to pick him up in my arms and carry him there. And I didn't make it to Tuskegee. I didn't even go to college until I came out of the Army under the GI Bill of Rights. But I respect her striving to make me an educated man to such an extent that I went to secondhand bookstores and college cast-off bookstores, gave myself a high school education and a college education before I got to college. Got to college, I got so bored with them little young idiots trying to teach me. They threw me out of NYU for objecting to the pool where they were teaching white history. Didn't expect them to teach Didn't expect them to teach black history at all. Didn't expect them to know it. But don't offend me by the way you teach white history, because I know that too.